Is it time to dismantle some doctrines? If you don't know what that means, then come along with me. I'm Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Bible college teacher and pastor of more than 20 years. Join me as we deconstruct whatever dogmas and beliefs have held you behind, and together work to reconstruct and rebuild your authentic self. Hey everyone, welcome to this special edition of the Dismantling Doctrine Podcast. I am your host, as always, Dr. Clint Haycock, and I know what you might be thinking. Wait a minute, this was supposed to be the episode with Lucas Wilson, talking about his experiences with conversion therapy, and that was indeed the case. However, just like the breaking story with Project Esther that I did a deep dive into last episode, the news has sort of overtaken, events have overtaken what's going on, and I decided to do a very deep dive into this guy, Vance Boelter, and these apparently political assassinations that took place not long ago in Minnesota in the United States. And I think it was in response, one of the listeners, either on YouTube or Threads, I'm not sure, asked me about doing a deep dive into his connections with the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation. So I started doing a little bit of digging, and of course, the further I went, just like any research project, the more you get into it, the more rabbit trails you go down. So what you're about to hear is a very deep dive, not just looking at Vance Boelter. We're going to look at his backstory a little bit, but what I'm going to do is really get into some of these key figures within the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation, most specifically a guy named William Dutch Sheets. And we're going to find out that he was also an alumni of the same Bible school that Vance Boelter graduated from. And guys like Dutch Sheets, other people like Lance Wallnau, and major figures within the NAR, these people are major figures fomenting the kind of radical incendiary rhetoric that I'm going to show in this episode. I think it's what radicalized Vance Boelter to do what he did. And he joins really a shockingly long list of anti-abortion terrorists, really Christian assassins, as we call them. This is really what he is. And I'm sure, of course, more about the story is going to come out. I've gotten the up-to-date information, but as the story breaks, there's more stuff that comes out almost on a daily basis about him, his wife, and so forth. So stay tuned, look at the news, see what's going on in terms of the updates to the story. But we will get to the episode with Lucas Wilson. That's going to drop next. And then after that, I've got an episode with my good friend Stephen Mather. He's a former Jehovah's Witness. I've had him on the show before, and I've been on their show, which used to be called Cult Hackers, which he used to do with his daughter. But now Stephen and I, what we did the other day is really good. We went through all 8 of the markers of cults identified by Dr. Robert J. Lifton in his book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, also in his article, Cult Formation. This is a really good discussion because what we did is Stephen and I compared stories. We compared basically testimonies, him as an ex-Jehovah's Witness, me as an ex-evangelical, and we went through point by point. We talked about how these things, these experiences that we had in our time, in our religions, in our cults really, how they affected us in terms of our psychology, as well as how the actual tactic is used by these groups. So if you're an ex-cultist, if you come out of religion, I think you'll find this episode really helpful. I've done this a number of times before. I did this with Chris Shelton. We compared stories, him as an ex-Scientologist and me as an ex-evangelical. In fact, speaking of Chris Shelton, I'm going to be on his show speaking of cults. And I contacted Chris the other day because I was saying, man, I've done more research since I did my episode on Project Esther. There's even more that's come to light. So I got a hold of him and said, Chris, we need to do an episode on your show now, really taking another deep dive into Project Esther, this issue of how the Heritage Foundation is using this policy paper to strip away our rights by weaponizing anti-Semitism. And this is what's happening right now in America. We're seeing it unfold in real time. So this is a real serious concern. Not a lot of people are talking about Project Esther, but I think it's super important right now, especially with what's happening, as I say, in the Trump administration, basically becoming an authoritarian fascist dictatorship. That's what he wants. And what Trump is doing is he's using things like Project 2025, Project Esther as his playbook to strip away constitutional rights. And like I say, this is happening right now in America today. So we need to be very concerned about it. Okay, before we get into this episode on Vance Boelter, I just want to make a couple of other announcements. I've been working very closely with my editor, Tim Sledge. He was the one who edited my book, Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard, Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. Very soon, literally any day now, my narrated version is going to be replacing the AI version on Audible. In fact, by the time this podcast drops, it may have already done that, but it's in the works. The files have all been uploaded on the Amazon servers. So really, really soon, this is going to start happening. And at some point, I'm going to do another episode where I give you another couple chapters of the book. If you haven't already read it, this might pique your interest to go out and buy a copy. And then, like I say, you want to check out the Audible version where I finally get the chance to do my own narration, which I felt was super important. Took me a long time to do it, but I think it's made it a much better product. So if you do pick up a copy of the book, or if you pick up the Audible version, do me a favor, leave me a review on Amazon. That helps with the book's ranking. And then I'll say finally too, if you appreciate my work and you want to support what I'm doing, you can become a part of the Dismantling Doctrine Podcast Patreon community. And as always, the links to that are in the show notes. You can have a look and become a part of the supporters of the show. We're also taking a break right now for the summer, but once September hits, we're going to be starting up our Dismantling Doctrine Podcast Zoom calls again. These are great calls. These are chances for you to meet with returning guests for about an hour on typically about the third Sunday of the month. So really good way to get a hold of these guests and get to know them, get to chat with them a little bit. And then finally, I would just say, if you have any thoughts, any questions, any comments about this show or any other one, if you have any listener questions, I still want to do a podcast where I just answer listeners' questions. You can send me an email at dismantlingdoctrine@gmail.com. So let me know what your thoughts, comments, questions are, and I'll do my best to answer them. And maybe, like I say, we'll do a whole show just with listeners' questions. All right, let's get on into this issue of Vance Boelter, Christian assassin who was radicalized by the New Apostolic Reformation. In the days since these horrific attacks occurred in Minnesota, the details of the story have begun to emerge more clearly. We now know that 57-year-old Vance Boelter of Green Isle, Minnesota, went on a shooting spree in the early hours of the 14th of June 2025. According to Riley Moser of CBS News, quote, Boelter, 57, is accused of shooting State Senator John Hoffman and his wife Yvette around 2 a.m. on June 14, shortly before fatally shooting State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark in their Brooklyn Park home. In between the two shootings, investigators said Boelter visited the homes of two other Democratic legislators. Those lawmakers have since identified themselves as State Representative Kristen Bonner and Senator Ann Rest. Police caught up to Boelter at the Hortmans' home, where they exchanged fire with him, the FBI said. Boelter, however, escaped out the back door after allegedly killing the Hortmans, end quote. To gain entrance to the Hortman home, Boelter had posed as a police officer, complete with police-style black SUV with police license plates, a fake badge and police uniform, and wearing a hyper-realistic silicone mask. Although he shot both the Hoffmans 17 times between the two of them, miraculously they both survived these numerous gunshot wounds. He was finally apprehended in a field near his home after an intensive manhunt 2 days later. More details are now coming to light about the alleged shooter. Robin Levinson King of the BBC observes that, quote, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, a Democrat, has called the shootings an act of targeted political violence. According to the Minnesota Star Tribune, Mr. Boelter wrote a rambling and incoherent letter addressed to the FBI in which he claimed the state's governor had ordered him to kill Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar as part of a supposed plot for Walz to take her spot in the Senate. There is no evidence of any such plot. Klobuchar and Minnesota's other U.S. Senator, Tina Smith, along with Walz, were among Democratic politicians on a list of around 70 targets found in Mr. Boelter's possession, according to local media, end quote. In addition to identifying 45 Democratic politicians and lawmakers, Boelter's hit list included reproductive rights advocates also. Moreover, it's also come to light that Boelter and his wife Jenny were doomsday preppers, meaning that they believed they needed to stockpile food, weapons, fuel, and water in case of a sudden apocalyptic collapse of society. A police search of his home on the afternoon of the 14th of June, just hours before his arrest, uncovered a massive cache of weapons. Moser of CBS observes that, quote, documents reveal that investigators found a total of 48 guns in Boelter's home, as well as a tub of ammunition. Of those guns, there were 20 rifles, 15 revolvers, 9 shotguns, and 4 pistols. Additionally, charges say officers found at least 3 AK-47 assault rifles and a 9mm handgun inside an SUV registered to Boelter. On a desk inside his residence, law enforcement found a note card with the names and states of public officials written on it, according to the search warrant. Investigators also recovered nearly $18,000 in cash from the home, end quote. Jenny Boelter, as it turns out, was taken into custody by law enforcement recently as she apparently tried to flee. The BBC article comments that, quote, his wife was pulled over in a traffic stop hours after the shootings. She was taking their 4 children to stay with friends, according to investigators. Jenny Boelter told the authorities her husband had warned her in a message that she should flee, documents show. The text stated something to the effect of they should prepare for war, they needed to get out of the house, and people with guns may be showing up to the house, wrote FBI agent Terry Getch in an affidavit released on Friday. In her car, investigators found about $10,000 in cash, passports, and 2 guns. Mrs. Boelter has not been charged with any crime. She said her husband had given her a, quote, bailout plan for what to do if she ever needed to leave the house, end quote. In a Guardian article, journalist Nina Lacani adds further detail when she says, quote, law enforcement officers pulled over Boelter's wife and 4 children hours after the shooting near Lake Mille Lacs, about 70 miles, 120 kilometers, north of the Twin Cities, apparently en route to Wisconsin. Boelter's wife consented to a search of her vehicle, where officers located a revolver in the glove box and a semi-automatic pistol in a cooler. Police also found a safe, Boelter's and the children's passports, and at least $10,000 in cash, according to an affidavit by FBI agent Terry Getch, end quote. Following her encounter with law enforcement on the 26th of June 2025, Jenny Boelter released a public statement disavowing her husband's actions. In part, the statement reads, quote, we are absolutely shocked, heartbroken, and completely blindsided. This violence does not at all align with our beliefs as a family. It is a betrayal of everything we hold true as tenets of our Christian faith. We are appalled and horrified by what occurred, and our hearts are incredibly heavy for the victims of this unfathomable tragedy, end quote. But if that's the case, a lot of questions remain. How could his own wife not realize that Vance Boelter had become so incredibly radicalized to the point of committing heinous acts of violence? Are we to believe that he successfully hid both his radical views as well as his plans successfully from his own family? We now know that shortly after the shootings of the Hortmans, Boelter texted his family on a group chat these chilling words, according to Shelby and Shapiro of ABC News, quote, Dad went to war last night. I don't want to say more because I don't want to implicate anybody, end quote, according to the affidavit. Now, going back to the article, they say Boelter also allegedly texted his wife, quote, words are not going to explain how sorry I am for this situation. There's going to be some people coming to the house armed and trigger happy, and I don't want you guys around, end quote. This text to his wife, Jenny, law enforcement officials surmise, is presumably what led to her fleeing an attempt to achieve their, quote, bailout plan. Jenny Boelter, is worth noting, has not yet been charged with any crime, although according to reporting, she was not entirely forthcoming with information about her husband when police at first questioned her. But let's not forget that Jenny Boelter, by fleeing with weapons and a significant amount of cash as well as passports, was apparently enacting their so-called bailout plan in case of what Vance Boelter referred to as, quote-unquote, exigent circumstances. It's really hard for me to believe that she knew absolutely nothing about his extreme views or plans, but I suppose it is technically possible. Despite her statement distancing herself from her husband's actions, perhaps more will come to light as the investigation continues. The state of Minnesota has currently charged Boelter with 2 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree attempted murder. He also faces 6 charges in federal court of murder and stalking, and federal prosecutors have stated that he may even face the death penalty. In the days leading up to the shootings, police have discovered that Boelter surveilled his victims' homes, taking careful notes on their activities and movements, as well as details about their house's surroundings. His first court hearing is scheduled for Friday, the 27th of June, 2025, but according to news reporting, that appearance could be canceled if he is indicted by a grand jury. Although more could be added, this is a basic overview of this developing story that, as I say, most of you, if you've been following the news, you're doubtless familiar with so far. But what do we know about Boelter's backstory? What about his work life and his education? He's listed as having a doctorate degree, so he was not simply some uneducated hick from the backwoods, a typical Trump loyalist, a MAGA cult member who was armed to the teeth. According to an article in World, journalist Carolina Lumeta fills in some of the details. Quote, Boelter comes from a predominantly business background. His LinkedIn profile, which has been taken down, listed that he had a bachelor's degree in international relations from St. Cloud State University in Minnesota and a master's in management and a doctorate in leadership from Cardinal Stritch University, a Catholic school that has since closed. He worked in production and management for several food companies, including Nestle and Johnsonville Sausages. In 2018, Boelter and his wife, Jenny, founded the private security company Praetorian Guard Security Services in the Minneapolis area. As of May, he put an open to work sticker on his LinkedIn profile and said in a post that he was seeking new positions, possibly in the food industry. Most recently, he worked for a funeral home, generally tasked with retrieving dead bodies from assisted living facilities. Boelter also attended the 2-year Christ for the Nations Institute in Dallas, Texas, though he did not list the experience on his resume, end quote. We'll delve much more into that detail in a bit, but I find it fascinating that Boelter, on his professional resume, did not list that he had attended CFNI, or Christ for the Nations Institute, in Dallas. Why leave that important detail out? That experience, I believe, is the key to understanding his radicalization and deserves much closer inspection. Therefore, while that much is known so far about Boelter, undoubtedly more will come to light as the story continues to unfold. But what made the news more polarizing were the various reactions to the story shortly after the news broke. Some on the political right immediately blamed Democrats, while others on the left quickly pointed to his support of Trump. Salsari Berga of Time magazine noted that, quote, in the aftermath of the deadly Minnesota shootings, several prominent right-wing voices have falsely cast blame on Democrats for the violence, despite the suspected shooter's apparent support for President Donald Trump and the Republican Party. The president's son, Donald Trump Jr., told News Nation Monday that the suspect in the shootings, which killed one state lawmaker and her husband and wounded another and his wife, seems to be a leftist and is a Democrat. Days earlier, Utah Senator Mike Lee drew swift backlash when he pointed the finger at, quote, Marxists in a post on X after news of the shootings broke. Lee has since deleted that post and some others about the shooting following criticism, end quote. Lee also posted on X in another now deleted post the day of the shooting, the statement that, quote, this is what happens when Marxists don't get their way, end quote. He also shared a picture of Boelter and called Marxism a, quote, deadly illness. Elon Musk posted on X the Saturday after the shooting in an obvious reference to Boelter's actions that, quote, the far left is murderously violent, end quote. That same day, far-right activist Laura Loomer posted on X that, quote, the media wants to gaslight you into thinking the shooter in Minnesota is a Trump supporter. He was appointed by Waltz. He was friends with Waltz, and he had no Kings flyers in his car, end quote. Clearly, the fact that he was at one point an appointee of Democratic Minnesota Governor Waltz has only served to muddy the story further. And finally, according to Berga, quote, Wisconsin Representative Derek Van Orden claimed that the gunman was a liberal who, now quoting Van Orden, decided to murder and attempt to murder some politicians that were not far left enough for them, end quote. He also called Waltz a clown and stupid in additional posts, end quote. It has since come out, however, that Boelter was, according to those who knew him closely, a Republican and a supporter of Trump. We also know that he was some sort of ordained evangelical pastor who preached a few sermons at Laborn Matadi Church in the Democratic Republic of Congo back in 2023. The media has made much of the statements Boelter delivered at this church. In the context of a discussion about the power of the Bible, Boelter stated in one of his sermons that, quote, there's people, especially in America, They don't know what sex they are. They don't know their sexual orientation. They're confused. The enemy has gotten so far into their mind and their soul, end quote. He concluded that portion of the sermon by stating that the Word of God could reach down far enough into such a confused person's psyche, implying that it had the power to fix their misguided sexuality. We also know that Boelter was anti-abortion, preaching in Congo at the same church a few years ago on the subject. Odette Youssef of NPR notes that, quote, close associates of Boelter, as well as speeches he made at Christian gatherings while living in Africa 2 years ago, portray a man whose worldview was fundamentally shaped by his religious beliefs. He was deeply opposed to abortion and railed against churches who don't share that view. Now, quoting Boelter from one of his sermons, Boelter said, quote, many churches in America don't listen to Jesus. They're divided. This little group here, this little group here, this little group here, he said during one of those sermons, pausing frequently as an interpreter translated his words into French. Now going on to Boelter's statement, quote, and the enemy, the devil, comes through and rips everything apart. These churches are so messed up, they don't know abortion is wrong, many churches, end quote. At another point in the same sermon, Boelter spoke about his belief that the various churches in the U.S. would one day unite. Now going back to Boelter's sermon, he said, quote, God is going to raise up apostles and prophets in America to correct his church, he said, end quote. I believe that it is this precise wording, Boelter referring to, quote unquote, apostles and prophets correcting the church, that provides the key to unlocking Boelter's radicalized worldview. It's one that would turn him from a seemingly normal, stable evangelical Christian to a vicious murderer and stalker of his political opponents. It's also worth observing that if this is indeed the case, that it was his opposition to LGBTQ and abortion rights that motivated Boelter to act, he is far from the only evangelical to commit violence for such a cause. I don't want to get too far off track at this point. It's worth delving into this subject to establish the wider context. I've interviewed Frank Schaeffer numerous times on my podcast, speaking of his time growing up at L'Abri, his father's retreat center, which was located in the Swiss Alps, and his involvement in the anti-abortion movement. If you want to hear more about how Frank convinced his famous father, Francis Schaeffer, to become such a staunch anti-abortion evangelical activist, you can go back and find those episodes. You can look on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and so forth. But I'll just mention here that according to a piece that originally aired on BBC Radio 4 by host John Ronson, the origins of the anti-abortion evangelical movement date back to the early 1970s. It was a young Frank Schaeffer, just 19 years old, who convinced his father Francis to allow him to direct a film series entitled Whatever Happened to the Human Race. It was this film series that, according to Frank, more than anything else in the 1970s, helped to kickstart the evangelical anti-abortion movement. For the record, Frank is deeply sorry for his role in this and has spent decades trying to make amends for his actions all those years ago. Referring to the murder of Bart Slepian by anti-abortion activist Jim Kopp, Frank Schaeffer wrote in an email to Ronson, quote, my father and I had blood on our hands for the killing of Dr. Barnett Slepian and many other abortion providers, Frank states in an email to John. There is a direct line from what we Schaeffers did to Jim Kopp murdering a doctor after reading my father's anti-abortion books and watching the movies I produced. Going on, Frank says, I have no words to express my sorrow and the depths of my repentance for my stupidity and callous regard for basic decency and the value of human life. I beg for forgiveness. I am ardently pro-choice and work to defend women's rights that I and my father did so much harm to in the 1970s and 80s, end quote. Of course, there's no way that Frank Schaeffer could have known that his work would lead to such horrific ends, but hindsight proves to be both a curse and a blessing. Returning to that BBC Radio 4 piece, Ronson cites a statement by Amanda, the niece of the murdered abortion provider Bart Slepian. Johnson states, quote, one victim was abortion provider Bart Slepian. When things became dangerous and doctors began to be targeted, many of his peers packed it in, but Bart remained steadfast. My uncle was like, no way are a bunch of idiots going to bully me out of doing my job, recalls the doctor's niece Amanda. Bart's killer was a man named Jim Kopp. Jim was the kid in his family who was expected to pursue a career in medicine himself, but after graduating with a biology degree, he knew he couldn't cut it. and so he turned to religion. He took a pilgrimage to L'Abri, and there, quote, he got radicalized, believes Amanda. Francis had published a book, a Christian manifesto, that came very close to advocating violence against doctors. Now, quoting Amanda, she says, something Francis Schaeffer liked to say is, if you're a Christian, act like it, says Amanda. If you really think killing fetuses is the equivalent of killing 5-year-olds, well then, you have a moral obligation not to stand by and let the children be murdered. Going back to Ronson, he says, and so Jim traveled to Buffalo, New York, and hid out in the woods behind Bart's house. On October 23, 1998, Bart came home from synagogue services, put down his keys, and started warming up some soup in the microwave. Then there was the sound of tinkling glass, and Bart said, I think I've been shot. A bullet flew around the house, through Bart, off the kitchen cabinet, narrowly missing one of his children, and into the mantelpiece. Before the dinner went off on the microwave, Bart was dead, says Amanda, end quote. And Ka, who may have actually participated in more shootings than are known about, is far from the only individual engaged in anti-abortion violence over the decades. Incidents have included kidnapping, arson, bombing and vandalism of abortion clinics, the posting of, quote, wanted-style posters of abortion providers online, along with a monetary reward offered for their arrest, conviction, or revocation of their medical licenses, and murder or attempted murders of abortion providers are stopped. The long list includes the aforementioned James Cott, Michael F. Griffin, 1993, Paul Jennings Hill, 1994, Peter James Knight, 2001, and Scott Reeder, 2009. Should we now add the name of Vance Boelter to this growing list? In the United States alone, since the 1970s, there have been at least 11 murders, 42 bombings, and 200 arsons in abortion clinics, and 531 cases of assault against abortion providers or patients. One murder occurred in Australia and several attempted murders in Canada also. And keep in mind, most, if not all of this, stems from anti-abortion evangelicals, otherwise known as Christian terrorists, who justify their extremist violence on religious grounds. Their argument is that they are prepared to go to virtually any length, including bombing, arson, and murder of abortion providers to protect the lives of unborn babies. Just as one example, Flip Bennon, director of the anti-abortion organization Operation Rescue, said in a statement in 1995 that, quote, this whole thing isn't about violence. It's all about silence, silencing the Christian message. That's what they want. Our inflammatory rhetoric is only revealing a far more inflammatory truth, end quote. That truth, apparently, is about the violence the so-called, quote, abortion-providing industry is doing to discredit the anti-abortion movement and silencing the message of Christianity. It's worth noting, therefore, that given such a track record of extremist violence by anti-abortionist evangelicals, Boelter's actions would appear to fit right in, and this movement is far from being finished despite the Christian rights victory in overturning Roe v. Wade just a few years ago. In his BBC Radio 4 piece, Ronson concludes by observing that, quote, there were pro-life activists among the Trump supporters who flooded Capitol Hill in Washington on January the 6th, 2021. Some of our leaders were there, says Rusty, referring to Reverend Rusty Thomas, head of Operation America, the largest anti-abortion group in the USA today. Going back to Thomas, he said, quote, some of our leaders knew that this was going to be a tremendous gathering and a great opportunity, and so they set up a powerful sound system near the monument, end quote. Going back to Bronson, he says, and in September 2021, the U.S. Supreme Court allowed Texas to end legal abortion after 6 weeks in an attempt to cut off access to almost all abortion for millions of people. There's a very wide swath in this country where it's almost impossible to get an abortion now, says Amanda. She, of course, was the niece of murdered abortion provider Bart Slepian. And she goes on to say, to go to a clinic, you have to drive. They're usually far away. It costs a lot of money, and you're seeing women self-abort a lot more. It's Schaeffer ripples, she says. That guy and his weird obsession, end quote. And I don't want to get too far off track, but I think it's important to set Boelter into the context of the much larger story of the anti-abortion violence movement. Let's return now to the story of Boelter and his extremist actions. Can we say for certain that he became radicalized by his exposure to the violent rhetoric employed by those within the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation. According to author and investigative journalist Frederick Clarkson, who's been on my podcast several times, the words Boelter used in his sermon in Africa reveal an important clue that he was in fact influenced deeply by the teachings of the NAR movement. Clarkson told journalist Youssef in that NPR article, quote, "Nobody talks like that unless you're a part of the NAR. Nobody's talking about God sending apostles and prophets to correct the church in America unless you're somehow influenced by NAR. That's strong evidence," end quote. It's worth investigating this question more closely. What exactly can we say about Boelter and his ties to the NAR, and whether that had anything to do with him being radicalized to the point of committing political murders and framing it as dad going to war? What motivates a seemingly normal evangelical to commit such horrific acts of violence? Apparently, Boelter, who had a fairly small social media profile, nowhere directly states that he was affiliated with the NAR or was influenced by any specific NAR leaders that we know of. But this is not unusual among this crowd, since this is not an actual denomination. It's rather more of a loosely affiliated network. What's telling is the language he used, as Frederick Clarkson picked up on, which is common parlance among NAR figures. This is, I think we can say, a clear case of loaded language, what Dr. Robert J. Lifton describes as insider jargon. It's used by cults or other high-control religious groups. Only those in the know, in other words, insiders within the movement, have a full understanding of the phrasing used within the group. Outsiders, unfamiliar with the jargon, are therefore left in the dark. Journalist Bob Smetana of Religion News reports that another one of my former guests, Matthew D. Taylor, he's an expert on the NAR and its history. Taylor stated that he picked up on the key wording just like Frederick Clarkson did. Taylor, quote, listened to some of Boelter's sermons from overseas and said he did not hear any calls for violence, but did hear influences of the New Apostolic Reformation, a movement of independent charismatic apostles and prophets that seeks to have Christians dominate all aspects of society, including the government. Taylor said opposition to abortion, which is common in NAR and other charismatic Christian circles, has spiritual overtones, with abortion often depicted as a kind of child sacrifice. Now, quoting Taylor, he says, quote, I think it is significant that he, Boelter, has apparently spent most of his life in and around communities in channels through which pretty radical ideas are flowing, he said, end quote. These connections between Boelter and the world of the NAR have drawn attention to his alma mater, CFNI, Christ for the Nations Institute, which is an independent charismatic Bible school out of Dallas, Texas. Boelter attended there. It began in 1988. He graduated from CFNI 2 years later, 1990. He eventually would earn a diploma in practical theology and pastoral ministry. While not specifically affiliated with the NAR, CFNI, as I mentioned, is an independent charismatic college that preaches many of the tenets found within the NAR movement, such as the use of spiritual gifts, things like tongues, interpretation of tongues, miracles, healings, etc., strategic spiritual warfare, the baptism of the Holy Spirit, the importance of apostles and prophets for the church, and so on. CFNI also had a prominent quote from its founder, Gordon Lindsay, advising that each student, quote, pray at least one violent prayer per day, end quote. It was apparently on a poster in the school's lobby. When pressed on this, a student explained to author Jeff Charlotte during a visit there that, quote, these violent prayers, no, they were all about fighting the culture wars in America, said the student. They're not about committing actual physical violence, but one can see that for someone like Boelter, this could certainly be taken in another, far more radical way. I think at this point it's worth investigating this issue a bit further. Let's look at this issue of violent prayers. They're what's known in theological jargon as imprecatory prayers. They're modeled after many such prayers found in the book of Psalms in the Hebrew Bible. The term imprecatory, although we hardly use it today, it describes something that expresses or contains a curse or a prayer for evil to befall someone or something. It implies basically invoking harm or misfortune upon another person. In biblical terms, imprecatory prayers call for things like divine retribution, judgment, and curses on the enemies of God or perceived enemies of God, as well as God coming to the aid of his people who are being persecuted or wronged by evildoers. While there are several imprecatory prayers found within the book of Psalms, one of the most controversial I'm going to share with you is found in Psalm 137, which in its context, historically, it's a lament. It's apparently written during Israel's period of exile in Babylon. Now, for those of you who've never heard an imprecatory prayer, it's worth quoting a bit of it so you can kind of get a feel for how these things go. Reflecting on the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Edomites, one of the sworn enemies of God and Israel who helped the Babylonians plunder Jerusalem around about 587, 586 BCE, the author cries out to God, picking it up in verse 7, 8, and 9. The author says, quote, "Remember, Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, those who said, lay it bare to its foundation. Daughter of Babylon, you devastated one, blessed will be the one who repays you with the retribution with which you have repaid us." Now, up to that point, maybe it's not so bad. You think, all right, well, payback like for like. But then the last verse is the most sort of horrifying one. It says, quote, "Blessed will be the one who seizes and dashes your children against the rock," end quote. That's the New American Standard Bible version. Other imprecatory prayers in the book of Psalms include this same type of violent language, calling for God to destroy savagely his enemies, using typically brutal language. But what's the relevance for such violent prayers for believers today? This is a real question. Is this something that God wants to get behind? If a Christian, for example, wants to pray such a violent prayer now? Well, it's interesting. I found quite revealing on a Desiring God YouTube video that was posted about 15 years ago. The question asked of Dr. John Piper was this: should Christians pray imprecatory prayers? In other words, should a believer pray those kind of prayers today? Now, his answer was really interesting, which I don't want to get into here. I wish I had more time, but far more interesting for our purposes was the comment left 7 years ago by one at the Drew. I guess that's his username. Now, Drew stated, quote, "In America, I've prayed often for doctors who perform abortions and the abortion industry, even people like Cecile Richards. I pray for repentance in all of their hearts." Now, up to that point, okay, I got no problem with what you're praying, Drew. If you want to pray for repentance for these doctors, it's the conclusion to Drew's statement. He goes on to say, quote, "But if they will not repent, I pray that God will do whatever he needs to do to rid America and the world of the evil of abortion," end quote. I think that Drew's response to the question about imprecatory prayers is quite telling. It reveals the sort of theology of imprecatory prayers that may have motivated a person like Boelter to do what he did, regardless of the assurances that CFNI student gave to Jeff Charlotte that, hey, praying daily a violent prayer didn't really mean what it sounds like. Still, one has to wonder. Several prominent evangelicals are alumni of CFNI, but the one most interesting for our purposes is one Dutch Sheets. He and his wife Cece graduated from CFNI in 1978, earning a degree in biblical studies. He then taught there as an adjunct professor from 1986 to 1999, and then came back to serve as its executive director from 2012 to 2014. Now, according to Matthew D. Taylor, Sheets was, quote, radicalized while a student at CFNI and later went on to have a major career as an NAR prophet and apostle. He also jumped on the Trump train early on. He became a major figure promoting the big lie after the 2020 election. He was also one of the quote-unquote prophets who, in the run-up to the election, confidently predicted that God had told him Trump would win by a landslide. But afterwards, along with several others who had clearly gotten it wrong, Sheets and his fellow prophets had to perform all sorts of rhetorical twists and backflips to explain why they weren't false prophets. By claiming that the election was stolen, not lost, allowed prophets like Sheets to take refuge in the fact that they hadn't been wrong in their prediction of a Trump landslide victory. Aside from his Trump re-election prophecy, what else do we know about Sheets? What's his connection to the NAR? In a 2022 Rolling Stone article on Sheets and the NAR, journalist Tim Dickinson states that, quote, "William Dutch Sheets is a leading figure in a fundamentalist movement known as the New Apostolic Reformation, whose followers believe America is anointed by God to convert the world to Christianity, by force if necessary, and they seek to accelerate Jesus' return and rule over the earth. This divine mission, as they see it, will be carried out when true believers seize control of the institutions of the U.S. government. Their allies in positions of power include members of Congress, as well as a prominent candidate for governor, Doug Mastriano, who is Donald Trump's pick to lead Pennsylvania, end quote. We also know that Sheets helped to popularize the Appeal to Heaven flag, arguing in his 2015 book, Appeal to Heaven, that the evergreen pine tree symbol on the flag was actually about God's covenant with Abraham. And during the Revolutionary War, God helping the colonists to vanquish the British was only part of the plan. According to Sheets, the far bigger picture was about God creating America as a weapon by which to spread the gospel all over the world. The Appeal to Heaven flag has now become a fixture among Republican politicians and MAGA faithful alike, all the way from Mike Johnson all the way up to Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. Essentially, it's been co-opted as a symbol of Christian nationalism and the push for a Christian-minded government or Christian-controlled government. But if this appeal to heaven is to be answered by God, according to Sheets, America must first return to its Christian nation status. Now, what exactly would that look like? It turns out that this theocratic vision is not all rainbows and unicorns, especially if you happen to be of another faith tradition or an atheist, or you might belong to the so-called woke generation. According to Dickinson of Rolling Stone, there's a very dark side to this version of Christian nationalism promoted by Sheets. Note the following statements. These are taken from a sermon that Dutch Sheets preached in 2019. Dickinson notes, quote, "For America to be the nation God intended," Sheets insisted, "it must end religious tolerance." Now, quoting Sheets, "Lord, we refuse to give this nation to another God. We refuse to give this nation to demons," Sheets preached, citing Hinduism and a pluralistic mindset as examples of the evils he despised. Now, going back to Sheets, Sheets said, quote, "We decree over this nation that the spirit of Islam will not take over America," he said. To the contrary, Sheets insisted, quote, "We say that Christianity will invade Islam," end quote. Darkly, Sheets implied that violence will be necessary. Now, quoting Sheets again, he says, "We decree and declare that, though it may require the blood of many martyrs, God will have his way," end quote. And Dickinson resumes, he says, quote, "In Sheets's vision, Christians will take over Washington, D.C. Now, going back to quoting Sheets, he said, quote, "We believe you're," that's God, "going to raise up constitutional judges," Sheets said. "We believe you're going to put somebody in the White House that will say, 'Oh, yes, we are a Christian nation,'" end quote. And of course, now Sheets is undoubtedly ecstatic that Trump has won a second term, viewing his 2019 statements as proof positive of a divine prophecy that's come to pass. Moreover, Trump's appointment of 3 conservative judges to the Supreme Court in his first term and the subsequent overturning of Roe versus Wade would also be viewed by people like Sheets as major victories. And these are the beginnings, they would say, of returning America back to its fabled Christian nation status once again. Now, of course, they're taking aim at LGBTQ rights. Sheets has also made use of violent rhetoric in the context of spiritual warfare, and this language fueled a great many Christian nationalists who took part in the January 6th Capitol riots or insurrection. Winika Leedon, in a Southern Poverty Law Center article, speaks about Sheets and his involvement in the January 6th insurrection when he notes, quote, "For many NAR leaders, Christians must implement God's will within politics. The divine will not do it alone. For example, Dutch Sheets and Lance Wallnau started a campaign to undo Trump's defeat. Sheets used a daily devotional app he ran to rile up his members and promote the lie of Trump's reelection, and launched a prayer and prophecy tour after President Biden's election. NAR prayer groups were mobilized at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, as well as supporting prayer teams all over the country to exorcise the demonic influence over the Capitol that adherents said was keeping Trump from his rightful prophesied second term," end quote. The problem here is that with influencers like Sheets, Lance Wallnau, Cindy Jacobs, and other NAR, quote, prophets and apostles, their rhetoric has now seeped into the Christian right as well as mainstream evangelicalism. They advocate bringing the battle out of the spiritual realm and taking it into the physical realm. Dickinson goes on to comment that, quote, "Christian nationalism is on the rise among the religious right. Many among the fundamentalist faithful seek to live in a country where their biblical views are not just protected, but imposed on others as a matter of law. The proposition that America should be remade as a theocracy is most popular, according to a 2021 Pew poll, among white evangelicals, that is to say, the Republican base. And he concludes by saying more than a third of this group believes the federal government should stop enforcing the separation of church and state and declare the United States a Christian nation. A full 29% would like to see the federal government advocate Christian values. That these are minoritarian views is little obstacle in a Republican Party that has grown increasingly contemptuous of democracy and comfortable with MAGA-style authoritarianism, end quote. How exactly has this shift occurred? How has this become mainstream within the Christian right? Just give you one example. At major conferences and rallies, we're talking tens of thousands of people in attendance, Dutch Sheets has promoted both dominion theology tied together with Christian nationalism and violent rhetoric. Along with Gene and Terry Bailey, they're also big apostles and prophets of the NAR. Sheets co-wrote what's called the Watchman Decree in January of 2022. And I'm going to reproduce it in full here. I'm going to quote the whole thing so you can get an idea of the incendiary and dominionist language it uses. Sheets has long since promoted it at conferences and other speaking events. He urges the enthusiastic crowd to shout the last line together with him. Here's the Watchman Decree in full. And I copied this directly from the Elijah List website, which is a major NAR website and podcast and show on YouTube. Note, for example, A, the violent rhetoric used, B, the insertion of Christian nationalism as well, and C, the reference to the Seven Mountains Mandate, which of course we know is a stream of dominion theology. The Watchman Decree reads as follows, quote, "As a patriot of faith, I attest my allegiance first and foremost to the kingdom of God and the Great Commission. Secondly, I agree to be a watchman over our nation concerning its people and their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Whereas we, the church, are God's governing body on the earth, we have been given legal power and authority from heaven. We are God's ambassadors and spokespeople over the earth. Through the power of God, we are his world influencers. Because of our covenant with God, we are equipped and delegated by him to destroy every attempted advance of the enemy. We make our declarations. Number one, we decree that America's executive branch of government will honor God and defend the Constitution. 2, we decree that our legislative branch, Congress, will write only laws that are righteous and constitutional. 3, we decree that our judicial system will issue rulings that are biblical and constitutional. 4, we declare that we stand against wokeness, the occult, and every evil attempt against our nation. 5, we declare that we now take back our God-given freedoms according to our Constitution. 6, we declare that we take back influence at the local level in our communities. 7, we decree that we take back and permanently control positions of influence and leadership in each of the 7 mountains. 8, we decree that the blood of Jesus covers and protects our nation. It protects and separates us for God. 9, we declare that our nation is energy independent. 10, we declare that America is strong spiritually, financially, militarily, and technologically. 11, we decree that evil carries no power, authority, or rights in our land or over our people. 12, we decree that we will operate in unity going beyond denominational lines in order to accomplish the purposes of God for our nation. 13, and finally, we decree that America shall be saved, in all capitals. And it concludes, it says, we know this country was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. We know the truth. Therefore, we stand for truth and will never be deceived. Now, this is the part I think Dutch Sheets has everybody chanting at the rallies. It concludes by saying, we will never stop fighting, in all capitals. We will never, ever, ever give up or give in. We will take our country back. We will honor the one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. America shall be saved, end quote. And that's the decree, the Watchman Decree. To me, there's a lot of actually delusional parts in it. But anyway, What's the reference to being a watchman? Okay, we got to look at this. Since I'm a biblical scholar by training, this is taken from Old Testament books, Hebrew Bible, books like Isaiah, books like Ezekiel, a watchman on the city walls. It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. These people were tasked by God or the rulers of their city to look out for enemies on the horizon. Of course, they're there to warn the city's inhabitants of the threat of impending danger, an attack coming. And of course, this has been spiritualized by people like Dutch Sheets. A watchman today is a spiritual watchman. They're looking out for what's coming down the road in terms of attacks by the enemies of God. Now, note that also in addition to promoting the falsehood of Christian nationalism that says this country was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, they say, we know this is true. How many violent terms did you hear in that Watchman decree? Now, it uses language like fighting, not giving in, taking our country back, taking a stand, permanently controlling once they've taken dominion over certain institutions and so forth. Now, it's also worth mentioning here, while we're talking about Dutch Sheets, we're talking also about Cindy Jacobs. I don't want to get too much into her, but she's another major NAR influencer. She's seen as an apostle and a prophet. She's an affiliate with Dutch Sheets. She's also got a connection to CFNI, Christ for the Nations Institute, where both Dutch Sheets and Boelter graduated from. She's taught courses there, so she has a long affiliation with it. In her World article, Lumetta comments that, quote, Cindy Jacobs is an advisor to the school, that's CFNI, and a self-described prophetic intercessor. She has preached that God chose President Donald Trump to lead the country into a Christian faith. She recently headlined a Jerusalem prayer breakfast event at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida, end quote. So along with being a major NAR figure, along with people like Sheets, Lance Wallnau, and others, Jacobs is also a major Trump supporter, and it's worth mentioning, obviously, a Christian Zionist. And while I'm speaking of CFNI, it's worth noting that, of course, they disavowed Boelter's violence. According to Eric Killalea of Cron, the school put out the following statement on June 14th, just shortly before Boelter was arrested, and it reads as follows, quote, we are absolutely aghast and horrified that a CFNI alumnus is the suspect. This is not who we are. This is not what we teach. This is not what we model. We have been training Christian servant leaders for 55 years, and they have been agents of good, not evil, end quote. All well and good. But the issue here, I think, is that a guy like Boelter could have been radicalized at CFNI. What Matthew D. Taylor says, he was radicalized there. What with the violent rhetoric of things like spiritual warfare that's used, the demonization of political opponents, framed as being manipulated and controlled by demonic powers, and so forth. This is something, of course, that CFNI will never take responsibility for because, of course, they believe that they're right in what they're doing. And, of course, as I've already pointed out, Dutch Sheets, one of the most famous alumni, he was an instrumental figure in fomenting the January 6th Capitol riots and insurrection. Really an agent of good, eh? It's interesting that Jeff Charlotte, in his Substack article on Boelter, observes that CFNI's founder, Gordon Lindsay, was for a time devoted to promoting what would become a belief known as Christian Israelism. Of course, CFNI has conveniently glossed over this controversial period in a film they produced telling the story of the college's founding. Charlotte observes, quote, the Christ for the Nations film skips over the late 1930s and early 1940s, during which Lindsay was involved with British Israelism, an anti-Semitic movement which maintained that Anglo-Saxons were the true Israelites, not the Jews. That movement was forerunner of the white supremacist Christian identity movement. In 1940, Lindsay organized the Anglo-Saxon World Federation Convention, which was about what it sounds like, end quote. So what do we know about the NAR? What is it about its theology and worldview? The issue here, I think, is that how all that may have led to the radicalization of a guy like Boelter. Arguably, since the first Trump administration, the NAR's theology, which I've already said before, it's a combination of charismatic theology, dominion theology, and so forth, has increasingly captured the Christian right's attention and theology. According to Matthew D. Taylor, this is largely because during the first Trump presidency, the evangelical advisors closest to Trump were predominantly from the NAR crowd, the old guard from the Christian right, which tends to be non-charismatic, much more conservative theologically, found itself on the outside looking in, and of course they wanted access to power. As a result of the situation, many began to adopt NAR theology and phrasing, like the Seven Mountains Mandate and so on, to be allowed in the inner circle. This trend has only continued since Trump took office for the second time, For example, Paula White Cain now occupies a major position of power within his administration. Moreover, the wider evangelical MAGA movement has adopted the NAR concepts, things like spiritual warfare, taking dominion, political opponents cast as demonic enemies, and so forth. If we go back, we can look at that Rolling Stone piece. It was written back in 2022. Journalist Tim Dickinson pointed out then that, quote, the NAR movement in particular dovetails with the far right of the Republican Party because it blames the nation's problems on the same enemies: abortion providers, homosexuals, religious minorities, etc., with the distinction being that NAR followers believe these disfavored groups are literally satanic. They use this language of spiritual warfare, says Steve Snow, a professor of politics who published an academic paper on the NAR in the Journal of Religion and Society. It has inevitably moved over into the political realm so that your political opponents are demon-possessed, end quote. NAR dominionist and spiritual warfare theology and prophecies were key drivers, as I mentioned, behind the January 6th insurrection, spearheaded by guys like Dutch Sheets and other NAR apostles and prophets. We've already noted that Sheets in particular was a major driver behind the Stop the Steal movement after the 2020 election. Of course, that's a big part of what led directly to the January 6th insurrection. NAR adherents who promote its theology and worldview enjoy an outsized influence among Trump's evangelical advisors. A great many of their talking points, things like the Seven Mountains Mandate, Dominion theology, have become common parlance among the Christian right. I can't remember where I read it, but I recall reading somewhere that a high-ranking executive from the Family Research Council, now this is a theologically conservative organization, he made reference to taking the seven mountains of culture as part of their strategy. So it's become kind of the lingua franca now of the Christian right. So what can we make of Boelter? What do we make of his extreme actions? What exactly motivated him to do what he did? Manny Moreno, writing on the Wild Hunt website, observes that, quote, the fringes of Christian spirituality, once dismissed as extreme, are inching closer to the mainstream, end quote. Moreno went on to comment on David French's article on the subject, which was in the New York Times. He pointed out in his piece that, quote, French didn't just identify Boelter as a political extremist, he called him a Christian assassin. Now, quoting French, Boelter wasn't just a political assassin, he was a Christian assassin, French wrote, a person deeply connected to one of America's most radical religious movements, end quote. No wonder Trump MAGA evangelicals are so amped up about this. As I said before, why would a seemingly normal Christian man, an evangelical like Boelter, turn to political violence and become, in the words of French, a, quote, Christian assassin? Well, the answer, I think, as I've been detailing, he, along with countless other Trump-supporting evangelicals, has been fed a steady diet of violent rhetoric by Christian influencers, many of whom are affiliated with the NAR. I mentioned that a prominent tenet of the NAR is this idea of spiritual warfare, which involves taking dominion over the so-called seven cultural mountains of influence. These are business, government, family, education, arts and media, entertainment, and religion. These seven mountains within the NAR, they're framed as a theater of battle between God and Satan's forces. Moreover, for years now, NAR influencers, as well as many in the GOP, have framed Democrats as demonic or being controlled by Satan. Therefore, at a certain point, if you believe someone is literally demonic, they're being controlled by Satan, well, you think, well, this must take extraordinary means for me to combat, to fight against it. As I've said before, this is a case of moving the concept of God's soldiers going into battle. They're taking it from the spiritual realm right into the physical realm. Back to that Rolling Stone piece, Dickinson comments that the NAR is, quote, hyper-politicized and literally demonizes its opponent. If you're not an advocate for their theology, you're on the side of Satan. They view those who stand in opposition to Christian nationalism as afflicted by demons, and they view their struggle to impose biblical order as spiritual warfare, end quote. Now, while obviously not every adherent, every follower of Dominion theology or the New Apostolic Reformation will become radicalized like Boelter did to the point of committing murder, when coupled with political extremism, these ideologies can indeed become dangerous. Jeff Charlotte, in his Substack piece, comments on Boelter's journey that he served as the, quote, former president of Revo Formation Ministries and as a missionary in Congo, or possibly an aspiring oil man, or both, apparently preached a sermon in 2023 against churches that don't fight abortion. God, Boelter wrote in his sermon, will raise up an apostle or prophet to correct their course. Charlotte goes on to say, the hit list said to be Boelter's included, along with the names of Democratic politicians, those of abortion providers and pro-choice activists, the addresses of Planned Parenthood clinics. Boelter joins the theological tradition of murder for life, heir to the so-called Army of God, a long list of killers, bombers, kidnappers, poisoners, and arsonists whose names need no recitation, end quote. Journalist Stephanie McCrumman, in an article in The Atlantic on Boelter, speaks of the theology that motivates the NAR and how the CFNI has long since fed into that movement. Developing the backstory of Boelter's alma mater, she states that CFNI, quote, is a prominent training institution for charismatic Christians. It was co-founded in 1970 by a Pentecostal evangelist named James Gordon Lindsay, a disciple of the New Order of the Latter Rain, one of many revivalist movements that took hold around the country after World War II. Followers believed that an outpouring of the Holy Spirit was underway, raising up new apostles and prophets and a global end times army to battle satanic forces and establish God's kingdom on earth. Although Pentecostal churches at the time rejected latter rain ideas as unscriptural, the concepts lived on at Christ for the Nations, which has become a hub for the modern incarnation of the movement known as the New Apostolic Reformation. NAR ideas have spread far and wide through megachurches, global networks of apostles and prophets, and a media ecosystem of online ministries, books, and podcasts, becoming a grassroots engine of the Christian right, end quote. So by now, I think it's very clear that organizations such as CFNI have long had a major impact on the NAR movement, in fact, seen as foundational. But wait a minute, advocating political violence? Didn't CFNI denounce Boelter and claim that its alumni have long been a, quote, force for good, not evil? However, it's worth noting, as journalist Tess Owen of Wired discovered, there remains the issue of making that connection between spiritual warfare and actual physical violence. Owen notes that, quote, although independent charismatic Christians don't directly call for adherents to take matters into their own hands, they do see themselves as soldiers in the primordial battle of spiritual warfare, where demonic forces can only be overcome by prayer and carrying out God's will. Now, quoting Robert Jones, Jones says, quote, this binary good versus evil worldview transforms democratic politics into a deadly version of the board game Risk, where geographic territory, institutions, and leaders have come under the sway of Satan, says Robert Jones, president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute. They are not political opponents or neighbors with whom we disagree. They are literally the instruments of evil, end quote. Beyond the spiritual warfare aspect, Boelter would also seem to fit the profile of a Christian nationalist. Owen goes on to state that, quote, Vance Boelter, from everything I've read and heard, would clearly be a Christian nationalist, says Michael Emerson, the Baker Institute's Siobhan Fellow in Religion and Public Policy at Rice University. Going on to cite Emerson, he says, he found the perspectives and policies of the liberal left egregious, viewing such people and their work as anti-Christian and anti-God. They were harming the vision of a truly Christian identity and nation, end quote. In a further citation, Owen quotes Emerson again. He says, quote, the logic is straightforward. If Christian nationalism is to be realized, those of different faiths or no faith do not belong. They either must be converted, silenced, or expelled, end quote. Thus, at some point in Boelter's journey, he began to think that violent prayers, spiritual warfare, and political activism weren't enough. He needed to go a lot further and act out in an extreme act of political violence. The pressing issue, of course, to figure out is at what point did he indeed cross that line? At what point did he go full-blown Christian, radical Christian terrorist? The pressing questions are how and when. On this point, McCrumman observes that, quote, Minnesota authorities said that they'd found voluminous writings in the suspect's vehicle and at his home, and that he'd kept a notebook that mentioned about 70 potential targets, including politicians, civic leaders, and Planned Parenthood centers. Boelter is now facing federal murder charges for the fatal shooting of State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband, Mark. She goes on to say, state prosecutors have also charged Boelter with 2 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted second-degree murder for allegedly shooting and wounding State Senator John A. Hoffman and his wife, Yvette. Now, here's the important thing. She says, if Boelter's beliefs were a factor in the shootings, the question is not exactly what radicalized it. Frederick Clarkson, a senior analyst for Political Research Associates who has been tracking the NAR movement for years, told me, the worldview that Boelter appeared to embrace was radical. Clarkson said, now quoting Frederick Clarkson, quote, everyone brings faith to their life in the things they do. The question is, in what ways does your faith inform your actions and your decision-making, he told me. Now going on, continuing to quote Clarkson, without knowing exactly what motivated the shooter, we can say that being oriented into this kind of NAR thinking, to my mind, is just a matter of time before an individual or group of individuals takes some kind of action against the enemies of God and the demons in their midst, end quote. As I've been laying out the case, it seems clear that Boelter decided, as Clarkson put it, to take action against the so-called demonic enemies of God. In this connection, Moreno notes the New Apostolic Reformation is, quote, a powerful movement within independent charismatic Christianity. NAR promotes the restoration of prophets and apostles and views the secular state as a demonic force to be replaced by institutions rooted in Christian law. The NAR and the related independent charismatic movement are at home to many of the most extreme Christian Trump supporters who view Trump as divinely chosen to combat the godless left, end quote. Now, how do we know this is the case? Well, as we've been saying, look at the language used by prominent NAR influencers as well as that used within CFNI, Boelter's alma mater, Dutch Sheets' alma mater as well, and it's a major influencer, as I showed earlier, within the NAR community. Moreno goes on to point out that, quote, within this movement, that is the NAR, prophecy, spiritual warfare, and apocalyptic visions are not fringe beliefs, they are central. Influential figures like Jonathan Cahn openly compare Donald Trump to the biblical Jehu, a violent king who enacted divine vengeance. Cahn has said Jehu was chosen, quote, to make the nation great again and drain the swamp, directly tying prophetic violence to modern politics. He concludes by saying, a photo from CFNI's lobby even quoted founder Lindsay saying, everyone ought to pray at least one violent prayer each day. CFNI has since said that this was meant metaphorically to encourage passionate prayer, but the word violent is hardly neutral and its use matters, end quote. One can begin to see, I think, therefore, how a seemingly normal evangelical like Boelter could easily become radicalized after being fed a steady diet of such incendiary rhetoric. For example, I'll just give you one example of this. In the run-up to the 2024 election back in October of 2024, journalist Stephanie McCrummen attended a Christian right political rally in Wisconsin, and she was shocked at the violent religious rhetoric that she heard there. She reflects in an Atlantic piece at what she heard at the rally, stating that, quote, in the final moments of the last day, that's of the rally, some 2,000 people were on their feet, arms raised and cheering under a big white tent in the grass outside a church in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. By then, they'd been told that God had chosen them to save America from Kamala Harris and a demonic government trying to silence the church. They'd been told they had authority to establish God's kingdom and reminded of their reward in heaven. Now they listen as an evangelist named Mario Murillo told them exactly what was expected of Christians like them. Now, quoting Murillo, he said, quote, we are going to prepare for war, he shouted. And a few minutes later, I'm not on the earth to be blessed. I'm on the earth to be armed and dangerous. That is how 4 days under the tent would end, with words that could be taken as hyperbolic or purely metaphorical, end quote. So we're taking a quick look at this guy that McCrummen mentioned. Who's this Mario Murillo? In a 2024 article on the Southern Poverty Law Center site, writing about the NAR and its connections to Dominion theology, investigative journalist Joe Winnicka-Leiden explains Murillo's connection to an increasingly radical theology. He comments, quote, Dutch Sheets, Lance Wallnau, Mario Murillo, and Hank Kunneman are 4 of the most influential Christian leaders in the U.S., yet most people have probably never heard of them. as leaders of a Christian supremacist movement, they decreed publicly in 2022 that they have the God-given right to rule the United States and that they, quote, have been given legal power and authority from heaven. These far-right figures claim to be, quote, God's ambassadors and spokespeople over the earth who, quote, are equipped and delegated by him to destroy every attempted advance of the enemy, end quote. And he goes on to say, these men who made what is known as the Watchman Decree, which I read earlier, are among the leaders of the New Apostolic Reformation, NAR, a new and powerful Christian supremacy movement that is attempting to transform culture and politics in the U.S. and countries across the world into a grim authoritarianism. NAR adheres to dominionism, which Frederick Clarkson of Political Research Associates defines as, quote, the theocratic idea that Christians are called by God to exercise dominion over every aspect of society by taking control of political and cultural institutions. Now, going back to the article, he says, dominionism has long been a driver of anti-government extremism in the United States. NAR is the latest chapter and possibly the most successful in dominionists' modern effort to make their reading of Christianity authoritative and supreme in everyone's lives. And he concludes by saying, over the past 2 decades, NAR's influence has broadened beyond church walls, pouring out this form of Christian supremacy into the mainstream, already wreaking havoc on local communities and our democracy. Their influence is real. Not only did they have a voice in the Trump administration, but the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is closely aligned with NAR leaders. The goal of this new dominionism is to disrupt both more mainline versions of Christianity and U.S. democracy, and in its wake, take control of state and society and yoke everyone to their authoritarian vision of the world, end quote. I conclude, therefore, that such violent rhetoric is a feature, not a bug, of the NAR. Former guests on the podcast, Frederick Clarkson and Dr. Andre Gagne, co-wrote a Religion Dispatches article on this subject back in May of 2023. They commented that the spirit of January 6th animated both the NAR and much of its increasingly violent rhetoric. Let's not forget that one of the prominent NAR leaders, Dutch Sheets, talked about this earlier, had a major hand in fomenting the January 6th insurrection, spearheading as he did the Stop the Steal movement that fired up Trump supporters to attack the Capitol to overturn what they call the rightful election results. It's ironic, too, that none of these people have faced any sort of consequences legally for their actions. In their article, Clarkson and Gagne point out that, quote, Vance Boelter, a prominent apostle/prophet in the neo-charismatic New Apostolic Reformation, had an unusual Easter message this year. Rather than a traditional message of hope and eternal life, he issued an imprecatory prayer and a dark prophecy. Claiming to have heard prophecies lately about sudden deaths, Boelter himself prophesied. Now, quoting Boelter, he said, quote, in May, you're going to see some of the disciplinary hand of God come down upon those people that have been standing in the path of what he wants to do, end quote. Boelter's imprecatory prayers, or petitions for God to curse, or in some cases eliminate one's enemies, came in response to the criminal indictment of Donald Trump and suggested that God's answer to those prayers might come in the form of a, quote, backlash by the American people. And they go on to say this would be concerning enough in light of Boelter's prominence on Michael Flynn's Reawaken America tour, for example, but it appears to be a trend. The week before, Andrew Whalen of Texas-based Vanquish Prayer Warriors had also prophesied vigilante violence. On an April 3rd episode of Elijah Streams TV, he said that God had given him a dream in which he told Donald Trump that his greatest desire, now quoting from Whalen, to see, quote, Obama and Hillary hanging from a rope, end quote. In fact, he added, God confirmed that, again quoting Whalen, that's what justice is demanding. Unsurprisingly, options on his Vanquish Prayer Warriors website include Special Forces, War Room Writings, and OP Fury, i.e. Operation Fury, what he calls a prayer siege. And they go on to say, the disturbing claims that God is calling his people to organized vigilante violence is happening in the context of the evolving theology of the New Apostolic Reformation.
As we reported here at RD, Religion Dispatches, its unusual theology, church offices, and organizational structures promote a vision of end times Christian dominion via conquering the metaphorical 7 mountains of cultural influence: family, government, religion, business, education, arts and entertainment, and media. Such claims also suggest that the relative lull following January 6th may be over, and that some NAR leaders may be readying for a fresh round of revolt, end quote. Clarkson and Gagne reveal in their article that since World War II, an increasing number of Pentecostal and charismatic Christians fervently believe that God is in the process of putting together a global end-times army that is building and gaining strength. One day, they hold, this ultra-powerful army of God will take over the world, what Clarkson refers to as a, quote, theocratic vision. Perhaps even more concerning, as I mentioned earlier, this dominionist feature of the NAR is now animating much of the Christian right. A great many Christian right leaders who formerly would have disavowed the more extreme charismatic features found within the NAR are now using the language of the 7 Mountains mandate as part of their political mobilization strategy. Clarkson and Gagne go on to point out that within the NAR, there is a connection between spiritual and actual warfare or physical violence. They note that, quote, there's a relationship between what's termed spiritual warfare and physical warfare. NAR leaders increasingly refer to Democrats, liberals, feminists, and LGBTQ plus people, i.e. anyone with a different political, religious, or gender identity, as demonic and blame them for society's problems. Social science since World War II and the Nazi genocide has shown that under specific conditions, virulent demonization and scapegoating can and does create milieus in which the potential for violence is increased. Chip Burlett of Political Research Associates wrote in 2014, "What social science cannot do," he averred, "is predict which individual, upon hearing the rhetoric of clear or coded incitement, will turn to violence." And then they go on to say, Burlett's essay was titled, "Heroes Know Which Villains to Kill, How Coded Rhetoric Incites Scripted Violence." Indeed, villain identification has been going on for a long time, and NAR leaders are now featuring ancient scripts for modern violence and religious war. We hear it in the form of imprecatory prayers by religious and political leaders drawn from biblical texts calling on God to smite all enemies. We also hear in the blowing of shofars at events that are intended to confront demonic elements in society, notably at the Jericho March that preceded the invasion of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, end quote. In another RD article written that same year about the NAR and its apparent PR problems, Clarkson demonstrates how violent rhetoric used by leaders and influencers within the NAR could easily have been adopted by someone radicalized like Boelter. In 2023, Apostle Mark Pfeiffer of Chillicothe, Ohio, was named as the successor to the USCAL, the United States Coalition of Apostolic Leaders. On a group Zoom call organized by NAR leaders, Pfeiffer spoke about what he considers to be the most powerful, divisive, and defining issue of our day, same-sex and transgender ideologies. And Clarkson goes on to say, Pfeiffer, says that typical churchgoers aren't concerned about the controversies surrounding NAR and Christian nationalism, but they are concerned that, now quoting Pfeiffer, same-sex and transgender ideologies may be being taught in school and that kids are being exposed to this, end quote. And that sounds exactly like Boelter's words spoken during his sermon delivered at a church in the Congo. Clarkson goes on to point out that, quote, Trumpian apostle Lance Wallnau joined Pfeiffer's fear-mongering in July, telling attendees at the Her Voice conference, now quoting Lance Wallnau, quote, when it comes to movement in America, not everybody's going to become Christian to fight transgenderism, but everybody will fight transgenderism if we frame it as an attack against your children, end quote. Note the incendiary language used by Wallnau. Christians need to fight against transgenderism. It's also telling Trump on the presidential campaign trail made a number of inflammatory statements at his rallies about trans athletes, how he was going to bar trans people from serving in the military if he was elected, the, quote, improper use of bathrooms. There was only 2 recognizable genders. He spread lies about kids returning home from school, having had gender reassignment surgery without their parents' permission, so forth. You remember all the stuff he used to say, but since taking office, Trump has ramped up the war against trans people. He's instituted policies recommended by Project 2025 to strip them of their rights. So, have I answered the question? What do you think? Could someone like Boelter, the seemingly normal evangelical from Minnesota, how could he become so radicalized by his faith community that it motivated him to act out with extreme violence? And I think it's clear that Boelter could have easily become radicalized after hearing a steady drip feed of incendiary rhetoric from leading figures within the NAR community, people like Vance Boelter, Dutch Sheets, and so forth. Although it appears that we can't say for certain that he was imbibing this stuff on a regular basis, it's certain that something affected him deeply enough to the point where he took extreme action. It's also clear that his attacks on these Democratic lawmakers took a tremendous amount of time and planning for him to execute. Fortunately, police derailed his plans to attack the more than 70 other people listed on notebooks found in his car following his deadly assault on the Hortmans. Now we're going to head toward wrapping this thing up. There's a lot of information piled on you, but it's worth citing extensively from an interview done on NPR. It was aired on the All Things Considered show on June 17, 2025. It was hosted by Mary Louise Kelly, and she interviewed reporter Odette Youssef that I've cited from earlier. She had earlier investigated the story for NPR shortly after the news broke, commenting on how the violent rhetoric of figures within the NAR, like Dutch Sheets, who, as we said before, helped to foment the January 6th insurrection. Youssef moves from that to talking about Boelter and his deadly assaults. And the question posed to Youssef by Kelly was this. She said, quote, "You're talking about this has fed concerns about rhetoric, could inspire extremist violence. Is there evidence that would actually give cause for concern that this faith community might turn to violence?" Now, Youssef replied a little bit later. She said, "But in the context of these attacks in Minnesota, you have to look at the language and framing around the topic of abortion. Fred Clarkson from Political Research Associates says there's a reason to be concerned that the NAR is priming the pump for this kind of violence." Now, quoting from Fred Clarkson, he said, "There's been a decided uptick in the rhetoric and vision of violence in the United States from apostolic leaders for some time." Going back to Youssef, she says, "And within that rhetoric, Marie Louise, you'll hear abortion discussed as ritual child sacrifice and as something that empowers demons." And Kelly asks her, "Can we connect this, though? Can we connect extreme rhetoric with the violence we just saw in Minnesota?" And Youssef replied, she says, "So we know that Boelter railed against abortion in America during at least one sermon abroad, so it was an issue he cared about. And there was an interesting detail in the federal complaint filed against Boelter yesterday, which said that he sent a group text to his wife and other family members a few hours after the rampage occurred. And it said, 'Dad went to war last night.' This language of war is the language that the NAR uses when talking about taking dominion over society. Clarkson says it's clear who the enemies are in that war." And then finally concludes by citing Fred Clarkson again. Clarkson says, "The NAR views historic Christian churches and civil government and its leaders as enemies, as, infested with demons. These are things that they talk about all the time. The question is, at what point does the rhetoric meet the reality?" End quote. Finally, it's worth noting that despite its disavowal of Boelter's extremist actions, a place like CFNI could have easily radicalized someone like him. I'm going to leave you with this. I'm just going to conclude by citing Jeff Charlotte in his Substack piece. And what he did is he inserts a comment left by an alumnus of CFNI, and it's proof positive of its really, I think, a Manichaean black and white worldview. Charlotte writes, quote, "I'm pulling out from the comments below a description of the Institute's teachings from an alumna, Jessica Stradinger." Now he quotes her saying, quote, "I actually attended CFNI for just under a year. It was strongly suggested I leave before the end of the second semester. I can verify the teachings of them versus us mentality. We were told museums of nature and science were temples to Satan. We were told Deep Ellum, a section of Dallas with tattoo parlors and venues/clubs primarily, was evil and to never go there. Homosexuality was demonized and conversion therapy applauded. We were told to attend anti-abortion rallies. I actually got angry in the moment at the rhetoric preached there. The rest made me feel uneasy, but this one infuriated me in the moment. It was dehumanizing anyone pro-choice. We were not to listen to any music that wasn't Christian or classical, no movies that were beyond PG. People would accuse roommates who dared dress alternatively of being demon-possessed, a lot of speaking in tongues and being slain in the spirit. If you were not an ardent supporter, you didn't hear from God and you had no voice. She concludes by saying, I'd like to add, the creation science course was taught by Gordon Lindsay's son, who also wrote the required reading and workbook. Reading On the Origin of Species, of course by Darwin, was considered immoral and words of Satan, end quote. What struck me about reading her statement were the parallels to cult psychology and tactics. We could plug in, for example, cult expert Stephen Hassan's BITE model of authoritarian control. If you've never heard of it, it's an acronym standing for Behavior, Information, Thought, and Emotional Control, and these tactics are successfully used by cults or other high-control groups. Demonizing the other and setting up an us versus them mentality is oftentimes where it all begins, which of course she describes. And certainly hits all the four markers, I think. Let's go through each one. For example, behavior control. She was told not to go to certain sinful parts of Dallas, ordered to attend anti-abortion rallies. Information control, told to avoid all non-Christian music, no movies up to PG level, have to listen to Christian or classical music, avoiding books like The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, being fed only creation science material, and then of course thought control. She mentions in her statement several times that CFNI attempted to regulate what students should or shouldn't think about, for example, homosexuals, even those who dared to dress alternatively. And they say, of course, these were controlled by demons and so forth. And finally, emotional control. She talks about if you didn't hear from God directly, you had no voice. Now, how would that make you feel? Like some sort of second-class Christian or a superior Christian if you did hear from God? And she mentioned several times that she was infuriated at how CFNI treated those who were different, and as I say, literally demonized them. But of course, if she spoke out, as she mentions, she was strongly encouraged to leave by the end of the second semester. I think this fits also Lifton's category of what he calls the dispensing of existence, essentially being shunned or disfellowshipped within a group or a cult because you disagree with something they teach or you question the teachings of the leader or something like that, the dogma or the actions of the group. While this is complete speculation on my part, since again, we don't know the entire story of Boelter's journey and how exactly he was radicalized, I think I've shown throughout this episode that this is how the NAR operates, just like she describes in her piece, by literally demonizing those who are different, who live an alternative lifestyle, or simply disagree with you politically. What this does is it creates an us versus them, black and white mentality within adherents. Let's not forget when I was talking earlier about the many radical anti-abortion activists who murdered abortion providers or bombed abortion clinics, things like that. At some point, they were radicalized too, just like Boelter was. If your enemies are literally demonic, then at some point, radical action is needed that goes beyond simply praying an imprecatory prayer for God to enact revenge or judgment on your enemies. Now, returning to his Substack article after Stridinger's comment about her experiences at CFNI, Charlotte goes on to state, quote, that emphasis on Satan as an actual entity who needs to be contested not just spiritually, but in the material world is central to Christian nationalism's flattening of metaphor. Ephesians 6:12, a verse beloved in the traditions of Lindsay and Boelter, tempts the believer to project spiritual war outward against, quote, the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And he concludes by saying, there are different ways to wage spiritual war, some more literal than others. Faith healing of the sort practiced in Lindsay's tradition and in the modern ministries in which Boelter preached makes of spiritual war a physicalized reality, end quote. And as Frederick Clarkson asked, at what point does the rhetoric meet the reality? For Boelter, that question was not only asked, but it was also answered resoundingly on the 14th of June, 2025, when
Dad went to war.